All right, tonight, we are opening the files on a year of crisis. We've spent months digging through this extensive dossier. We're talking internal reports, declassified documents, hard economic data, and first-hand accounts to piece together a story that honestly has only been understood in fragments until now. We're going to connect the dots between a popular uprising in the Middle East, a radical new economic doctrine out of Washington, and a constitutional battle that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. This is our special investigation into the events that created the 2025 geopolitical shockwave.
And you know what's fascinating is that this huge global story, it really begins with a local spark. This quote, from reporting on the ground at the time, it just pinpoints the origin perfectly. The dossier is crystal clear that the initial trigger for the protests in Iran in late 2025 was economic pain. But, and this is crucial to understand, the economy was just the catalyst. The fuel for this fire had been piling up for years. The full report details this deep well of public anger aimed at systemic government corruption, severe restrictions on civil liberties, and just a complete breakdown of trust. So this wasn't just about the price of bread, it was about dignity.
So, to really reconstruct these events, we've structured our investigation into 5 parts. First, we'll start with a world on edge, looking at the unrest in Iran and its immediate ripple effects. Then, we're going to deconstruct the tariff playbook, this completely unprecedented economic strategy. Part 3, well, that covers the global consequences, retaliation and realignment. From there, our focus shifts back home in a challenge to power, detailing the legal and political war fought inside the U.S. And finally, we'll connect all these threads to map out the full impact of the 2025 geopolitical shockwave.
So let's dive right in. Part 1, a world on edge. The dossier shows that the protests that just erupted across Iran in December of 2025, they were really the first tremor of a much larger seismic event. What was happening on the streets of Tehran and other cities, well, it was not going to stay a domestic issue for long, not at all. It was setting the stage for a period of profound global instability.
Okay, so let's really break these catalysts down, because the dossier gives us some incredible detail here. The severe economic crisis, this wasn't some abstract concept. We're talking about hyperinflation that made people's life savings completely worthless and crippling sanctions that choked off access to essential goods. Then, on top of that, as winter set in, you had these massive energy shortages. The report has these accounts of families literally freezing in their homes, which fueled this very specific, potent kind of public anger. But simmering underneath all that were these long-standing issues, corruption that was just flagrant, and a brutal record of civil rights abuses. It's the combination of all these things that explains why the protests went from economic complaints to outright calls to overthrow the entire government so quickly.
The regime's response? Well, according to every single source in our dossier, it was immediate and it was violent. This number you see on the screen, 538, that's the minimum confirmed death toll compiled by human rights activists on the ground. And the report really stresses this. This is a conservative floor, not a ceiling. The real number is almost certainly significantly higher. But this figure alone, documented under incredibly difficult circumstances, it points to a level of state violence that wasn't just about dispersing crowds. It was about crushing a movement.
And a number like that, no matter how stark, can kind of hide the human reality, right? The dossier contains this deeply disturbing appendix cataloging individual cases. Let's just focus on 2 from a single day. In Fuladshar, Dariush Ansari Bakhtiariwand was shot by uniformed security forces using a Kalashnikov. The report notes he died from his wounds before any medical help could possibly reach him. Then, in a separate incident in Kudasht, a 21-year-old Amir Hissam Khodar Ufard was killed by a single gunshot to the head. What's so significant here, as eyewitnesses reported, is that the shooter was a plain-clothed agent who just melted back into the crowd. That detail is crucial because it points to this coordinated 2-pronged strategy of overt force and deniable targeted killings.
And this is the moment the whole crisis explodes, from a regional issue into a global confrontation. As images of the crackdown spread like wildfire, President Trump posted this message. The language itself is so significant. The capitalization of freedom, the 3 exclamation points, it's all designed for maximum impact. Now, according to sources cited within the dossier, folks who were part of the White House discussions, this wasn't just some impulsive tweet. No, it was a deliberate signal. It put the Iranian regime on notice that the world's primary superpower was not only watching, but was positioning itself as a patron of the protest movement. This single statement dramatically raised the international stakes. It also provided the geopolitical justification for the economic actions that were about to follow.
You know, that public declaration from the White House is the perfect bridge to the next phase of our investigation. With geopolitical tensions now at a fever pitch, the administration prepared its response. But the primary weapon, It wasn't going to be military. It would be economic, and it would be deployed on a scale and through a mechanism that had never been used before. This brings us to part 2, the tariff playbook.
Now, this right here is the absolute core of the strategy, and it's a critical point in our report. The administration's legal team decided to completely bypass the traditional, much slower methods for imposing tariffs, which would normally require getting congressional approval or these lengthy investigations by the Commerce Department. Instead, they reached for a far more powerful and frankly controversial tool, the president's authority to declare a national emergency. This let them act unilaterally and, most importantly, immediately.
You know, it's really worth spending a moment on IEPA, because honestly, this obscure 1977 law is absolutely central to everything that happened in 2025. As the definition says, it gives the president immense power to regulate commerce if there's a national emergency. But the key here is its history. For over 40 years, IEPA was the legal tool for targeted sanctions. Think freezing the assets of terrorist groups or sanctioning officials from North Korea or Russia. It was a scalpel. In 2025, the administration reinterpreted IEPA as a sledgehammer, arguing it gave them the authority to impose broad, sweeping tariffs on entire countries, even on global trade itself. This legal interpretation was, well, it was radical, and it would become the very basis for the court battles that were just around the corner.
And boy, did they put this new interpretation into practice fast. I mean, the speed was just breathtaking. The dossier lays out this timeline, which reads like an economic blitzkrieg. February 1st, they use an emergency declaration on fentanyl trafficking to justify a 10% tariff on everything from China. Just 12 days later, a memo establishes this reciprocal doctrine as official policy. In March, they use a different authority, Section 232, to expand steel tariffs, but, and this is a big deal, they eliminate all exemptions for allied nations. And then comes the main event on April 2nd, a day the White House itself branded Liberation Day. A new emergency is declared on the U.S. trade deficit itself, an economic metric, and that is used to justify a minimum 10% tariff on goods from nearly every country on Earth. The pace and the scale were absolutely designed to shock the global system.
And this quote, given by the president on that so-called Liberation Day, is maybe the most explicit explanation you're going to get of the legal philosophy behind these actions. It's a remarkably expansive view of executive power. The argument being made here is that the very act of declaring an emergency is a key that unlocks nearly unlimited authority for the executive branch to act, completely unbound by normal rules or congressional checks. This worldview, that an emergency justifies any and all action, is precisely what opponents would argue was a direct threat to the constitutional separation of powers.
So, okay, the United States has just gone and unilaterally rewritten the rules of global trade. The big question, obviously, is how did the rest of the world respond? That brings us to part 3 of our investigation, retaliation and realignment. Because this was not an action that went unanswered, not even close. The tariff shockwave triggered an immediate, powerful, and coordinated global reaction that escalated into a full-blown trade war.
Yeah, that's the central question for this whole part of the report. And while the backlash was definitely global, the dossier focuses heavily on the response from China, because it was the most direct and the most consequential. The escalating economic conflict between Washington and Beijing in the spring of 2025, it's a textbook case study in tit-for-tat retaliation and the weaponization of economic interdependence.
Okay, let's just walk through this timeline because the velocity here it's just astounding. On February 4th, the day the first U.S. tariff hits, China has its retaliation ready to go, targeting U.S. energy and agriculture. A month later, the U.S. doubles down, raising the rate to 20%. China responds by expanding its targets to meat and lumber. But look at the inflection point in April. After the U.S. imposes that global reciprocal tariff, China's response is no longer proportional. They jack their retaliatory rates up to 84%. And then, just 3 days later, without a new U.S. action, they hike them again to 125%. The analysis in the dossier suggests that this was a signal from Beijing that they were willing to absorb more economic pain than the U.S. The de-escalation in May only happened after immense pressure from industries on both sides.
But China's strategy went way beyond just simple tariffs. They pulled out what the dossier calls their economic nuclear option. In early April, Beijing announced new licensing requirements for the export of rare earth elements and magnets. This was a masterstroke of economic warfare. As a slide notes, China had a near-total global monopoly on these materials. They're not just components, they are irreplaceable building blocks for all advanced technology. We're talking about everything from the guidance systems and missiles and the magnets and F-35 jets to MRI machines and every single smartphone.
By simply holding up the paperwork for licenses, China could effectively turn off the supply tap to the entire Western world, creating a supply chain crisis that dwarfed the impact of any tariff.
And while that US-China conflict was really the main event, you have to understand this was a multi-front war. This chart really visualizes the response from other key partners. Canada, a close ally, hit back hard on the auto sector. The European Union retaliated with 25% tariffs on a curated list of nearly $24 billion in American products. The dossier details how the EU's list was reverse-engineered to inflict maximum political pain, targeting goods like bourbon from Kentucky and motorcycles from Wisconsin. And then you see China's response, which at a peak of 125% just completely dwarfs the others. The visual makes it plain as day. The US wasn't just in a dispute with a rival, it was embroiled in a trade conflict with its closest allies and largest trading partners, all at the same time.
So while this massive global economic war was raging, the tariff playbook was facing a second and, equally ferocious battle right here on the home front. This brings our investigation to part 4, a challenge to power. The administration's assertion of unilateral authority ignited a constitutional firestorm, one that was fought on parallel tracks through the federal courts and the US Congress.
Look, everything in the domestic battle really boiled down to this one question. It's a foundational issue of American governance. The U.S. Constitution explicitly gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. The plaintiffs in these lawsuits, a coalition of hundreds of businesses getting hammered by the tariffs, they argued that by using an emergency act meant for national security threats to set broad economic policy, the president was basically stealing a core legislative power. The administration's defense? That the trade deficit itself was an unusual and extraordinary threat, which justified using IEEPA. This was the central clash that the courts were asked to sort out. The legal challenge actually moved through the judicial system with remarkable speed, which really tells you how urgent everyone thought this was. The initial lawsuits were filed all over the country, but the first major ruling came on May 28th from the U.S. Court of International Trade, a specialized court designed for these exact cases. And their ruling was a stunning rebuke, flat out declaring the tariffs illegal. The government immediately appealed, of course, but on August 29th, the U.S. Court of Appeals affirmed the lower court's decision. This set up the ultimate confrontation. Just 11 days later, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, consolidating all the challenges into one landmark case, Learning Resources versus Trump.
And while the courts were doing their thing, there was this whole other fight going on just down the street on Capitol Hill. Democrats, being in the minority, tried to use the powers of the National Emergencies Act to terminate the declarations that were propping up these tariffs. As our dossier documents, these efforts were just systematically blocked by the Republican leadership in both the House and the Senate. The most dramatic moment came on April 30th, when a resolution to terminate the Liberations Day emergency came to the Senate floor. The vote was a dead-even 50-50 tie, which was broken by J.D. Vance in favor of upholding the emergency. That vote was a crystal-clear demonstration that the legislative branch was too politically polarized to act as a check on the executive, which meant the final word was going to have to come from the judiciary.
So here we are, we've reached the final part of our investigation. We've traced these threads all the way from the streets of Iran to the Oval Office, to the ports of Shanghai, and to the chambers of the Supreme Court. In Part 5, our job is to weave these threads together, to step back and finally see the full picture of the 2025 geopolitical shockwave.
The main conclusion of our entire dossier is this. These were not 3 separate stories happening at the same time. They were one story. They were interlocking, mutually reinforcing crises. The geopolitical tension around Iran created the political space for an aggressive unilateral action. That action took the form of the tariff playbook, which directly triggered a global trade war. And the radical legal justification for that playbook, well, that created a profound U.S. constitutional challenge. You cannot fully understand the trade war without understanding the legal theory behind it, and you can't understand the context for that theory without looking at the international tensions of the moment. Each crisis was both a cause and an effect of the others.
And so, our investigation, it doesn't really close with an answer. It closes with the massive question that the events of 2025 left for the entire world. The dossier we've examined meticulously documents what happened, but the consequences, they're still unfolding. What is the lasting precedent when a law designed to fight terrorists is used to set duties on imports? What happens to the balance of power inside the U.S. government when one branch can just unilaterally declare an economic metric to be a national emergency? And maybe the biggest question of all, how are global alliances reshaped when economic partnership is no longer a given, but is subject to the political winds of the moment? The 2025 shockwave itself has passed, but the new landscape it created and the precedents it set, that's the world we're living in now.